The 25,000-ton hull of the USS Empress wasn't just sailing through the North Atlantic. It was screaming. At 0300 hours, 300 feet of steel groaned under a resonance frequency that felt less like physics and more like a physical assault. In the bowels of the ship, the air was a suffocating soup of atomized diesel and salt spray, hovering at a brutal 110 degrees, while just inches beyond the bulkhead, the ocean was a black, freezing tomb. Jax Callahan stood at the center of the chaos, his boots planted on the vibrating grating. He didn't need a gauge to tell him the drive shaft was failing. He could hear it. It was the death hum, a high-pitched metallic shriek that signaled the steel was reaching its elastic limit. Above them, Admiral Thorne had just signaled emergency flank speed to outrun a U-boat wolf pack, oblivious to the fact that he was driving a stake through his own ship's heart. "Step aside, Callahan. That's a direct order." Commander Miller's voice barely carried over the mechanical roar. He stood by the main throttle, hand white-knuckled on the lever, his uniform soaked in sweat. "The Admiral wants speed, and you're obstructing a combat maneuver. That's mutiny." Jax didn't blink. His eyes remained fixed on the massive shaft, which was now vibrating with enough kinetic energy to liquefy the bearings. In his right hand he gripped a heavy pipe wrench. In his left, a crumpled, oil-stained blueprint that the naval bureaucracy had called unscientific tinkering. "If you push that throttle another notch, Commander, this shaft won't just break," Jax said, his voice eerily calm against the backdrop of the shrieking metal. "It's going to whip. It'll shear the hull like a hot wire through wax. You won't have a ship to court-martial me on." The ship lurched as a massive swell hit the bow, and the resonance deepened, a rhythmic thrum, thrum, thrum that shook the marrow in their bones. Jax felt the heat radiating off the steel. He knew the mathematics of failure better than any man with a degree. The shaft was seconds from shattering, and the only thing standing between 5,000 sleeping soldiers and the bottom of the Atlantic was a grease-stained mechanic who had decided that, for once, the machine mattered more than the rank. He raised his wrench, not as a weapon against the man, but as a tool for the steel, refusing to move until the screaming stopped. "The steel is screaming. Will you stay in the engine room? If you believe the worker knows more than the boss, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. We're going below decks for the untold history of the grease monkeys who won the war." Long before he was a mutineer in the North Atlantic, Jack Callahan was the patron saint of lost causes in the basement of a Brooklyn tenement. It was the height of the Great Depression, a time when things weren't replaced. They were exhaled back to life. While other boys were playing stickball under the L train, Jax was submerged in the damp, coal-dusted darkness of apartment furnace rooms. To the landlords, a boiler was a hulking mass of iron and rivets. To Jax, it was a living, breathing creature with a pulse. He possessed what the neighborhood called the Brooklyn ear. It was a gift that felt more like a haunting. Jax didn't look at a machine to see what was wrong. He closed his eyes and let the sound map the failure in his mind. He could stand in a freezing hallway and hear the exact moment a steam pipe 3 floors up began to calcify. He knew the difference between a healthy hiss and the wet, rhythmic rattle of a gasket about to fail. When the city's best engineers shook their heads at a cracked heat exchanger and declared a building cold for the winter, Jax would crawl into the soot, his ear pressed against the iron like a doctor's stethoscope. He spent his teenage years in a world of industrial percussion. He learned that every machine has a soul, and every soul has a breaking point. He found that if you listened closely enough, the metal would tell you exactly where it was hurting. He fixed unfixable boilers with nothing but a ball-peen hammer and a sense of timing that bordered on the supernatural. He would tap a valve, tighten a bolt by a fraction of a hair, and the screaming pipes would settle into a contented hum. But there was a price for the gift. The world became a cacophony of impending disasters. He couldn't walk past a delivery truck without hearing the hairline fracture in its axle. He couldn't sit in a cinema without the projector's stuttering gear tooth gnawing at his nerves. He saw the fragility and the strength of New York's industry. It was a curse of foresight, the heavy burden of knowing exactly when the steel would give up. By the time he walked into the Navy recruitment office, Jax wasn't looking for a fight. He was looking for a machine big enough to finally drown out the smaller breaks. He didn't realize he was simply trading a tenement basement for a floating tomb where the stakes of a missed heartbeat were measured in thousands of lives. The office of Dr. Alistair Finch smelled of expensive pipe tobacco and the terrifying arrogance of men who had never bled on a shop floor. It was a room of polished mahogany and pristine vellum, a sharp contrast to Jack Callahan, whose very presence seemed to smudge the atmosphere. Jack stood before the massive oak desk, feeling the weight of the grease etched into his knuckles, and laid out his heart on a sheet of butcher paper. It wasn't a standard schematic. It was a frantic, hand-drawn map of a solution, a stabilizer designed to counter the harmonic resonance he had heard during the sea trials of the new Mark XIV landing craft. Dr. Finch didn't even lean forward. He adjusted his spectacles and looked at the drawing as if it were a soiled rag found in a gutter. To Finch, the Navy was a series of elegant equations and peer-reviewed drafts. To Jax, it was a machine that was about to shake itself into scrap metal. "This," Finch began, his voice thin and sharp as a scalpel, "is an insult to the engineering corps, Mr. Callahan. There are no isometric projections here. Your notations are written in, is this graphite and motor oil?" He flicked the corner of the paper with a manicured finger, his lip curling in distaste. He didn't ask about the load-bearing tolerances or the vibration dampening. He didn't ask why a mechanic from the motor pool had spent 3 nights without sleep calculating the sheer strength of a drive shaft. He saw a lack of proper naval drafting protocols and deemed the man invisible. Jax tried to speak, his voice low and gravelly. "The math in the books assumes the steel is perfect, Doctor. But the steel we're getting from the mills is vibrating at high speeds. If we don't install these stabilizers, the shafts will snap like glass the moment they hit flank speed in a heavy swell. I've heard it. I've felt the pulse." Finch let out a dry, condescending chuckle. "You heard it? We operate on data, not intuition, Mr. Callahan. We are winning a war with science, not grease monkey folklore. Your blueprint lacks the formal rigor required for even a cursory review." With a dismissive flick of his wrist, Finch swept the butcher paper off his desk. Jax watched, paralyzed, as his life's work, the only thing that could save the fleet, fluttered into the wastebasket like literal trash. "Go back to your wrenches, Callahan. Leave the thinking to the men who can actually draw a straight line." Jax left the office with his ears ringing, not from the machinery, but from the deafening sound of an ego that was about to kill more sailors than a German torpedo ever could. The transfer orders were typed with a cold, bureaucratic finality that felt more like a sentencing than an assignment. For the crime of wounding Dr. Finch's pride, Jax was stripped of his shipyard status and exiled to the active duty roster of the USS Empress. To the brass, it was a punishment, sending a troublesome mechanic to the greasy, claustrophobic bowels of a troop transport. To Jax, it was like being locked in a room with a ticking bomb that only he could hear. The Empress was a behemoth, a 25,000-ton steel cavern designed to ferry 5,000 souls across the Atlantic. But from the moment Jax stepped onto the gangplank, he felt the sickness in her bones. While the rest of the crew marveled at the ship's fresh paint and massive scale, Jax walked the narrow corridors of the lower decks with his palm flat against the bulkheads. He could feel the ghost in the machine, a faint, rhythmic tremor that shouldn't have been there. It wasn't the steady heartbeat of a healthy engine. It was a sinister, discordant shiver that traveled from the propeller shafts up through the very ribs of the ship. As the fleet cleared the harbor and the coastal waters gave way to the deep, heavy swells of the Atlantic, the vibration intensified. While the other sailors slept in their cramped berths, Dreaming of home or the coming fight, Jack spent his nights in the dark of the hold. He was a man obsessed, navigating the labyrinth of pipes and heavy machinery with a flashlight and a heavy heart. He would sit in the furthest reaches of the shaft alley, the skin of the ship his only companion. He could feel the ocean pressing in on the other side of the steel, but more importantly, he felt the resonance growing. As the engines revved to maintain formation, the metal began to hum a low, mournful note, the sound of steel under impossible tension. It was the same death hum he had tried to warn Finch about, now amplified by the sheer mass of the troopship. To Jax, the Empress wasn't a fortress. She was a glass vase being vibrated toward a shattering point. Every revolution of the drive shaft felt like a countdown. He was a passenger on a floating tomb, trapped in a mechanical nightmare where he was the only one who knew that the ship was slowly tearing its own heart out. Admiral Thorne was a man carved from New England granite and polished by decades of naval tradition. On the bridge of the flagship, he looked out over the grey expanse of the Atlantic, seeing the world as a strategic map where victory was won through iron-fisted discipline and the unwavering execution of orders. When the frantic radio bursts confirmed a U-boat wolf pack was closing in from the north, Thorne didn't flinch. He didn't think about the metallurgy of the drive shafts or the microscopic fractures in the steel. He thought about the math of evasion. He looked at the vast convoy and saw only one solution: speed. "Signal the fleet!" Thorne barked, his voice cutting through the tension of the bridge like a blade. "Emergency flank speed. We outrun them or we die." Deep in the belly of the Empress, the command hit Jax like a physical blow. He heard the bells signal the engine room, a frantic, clanging death knell. As the stokers and engineers scrambled to feed the beast, the ship didn't just accelerate. It began to thrash. The low hum Jax had lived with for days escalated into a violent, percussive shudder that rattled the teeth in his skull. He sprinted for the internal comms, his face slick with a mixture of oil and cold sweat. "Get me the bridge!" Jax screamed at the terrified young ensign manning the phone. When the connection finally crackled to life, Jax didn't wait for protocol. "This is Callahan in the hold. You have to tell the Admiral to drop the RPMs. The resonance is peaking. The shaft alley is vibrating at critical levels. If we hit 20 knots, the Empress is going to shear herself in half." The response was not a question of physics, but of rank. The voice of a senior officer came back, cold and lethal. "Callahan, stand down. You are a mechanic, not a tactician. The Admiral has issued a direct order. Any further interference with the operation of this vessel will be treated as an act of mutiny in the face of the enemy." Jax stared at the receiver, the class war finally reaching its boiling point. On the bridge, they were playing a game of chess with lives they couldn't see. Down here, Jax was holding the board together with his bare hands. He looked at the massive shaft, now blurring into a terrifying, erratic wobble. To the brass, his warning was a breach of etiquette. To the steel, it was the truth. As the ship lunged forward, pushed by the Admiral's ego into a speed she was never built to survive, Jax realized that the chain of command was about to become the anchor that dragged them all to the bottom. The Empress hit 20 knots, and the world dissolved into a cacophony of dying metal. It was the vibration sweet spot, that precise mathematical intersection where the rotation of the massive drive shaft matched the natural frequency of the hull. To the officers on the bridge, the ship had simply become unsteady in the heavy seas, but in the lower decks, the reality was far more visceral. The resonance had transformed the troop transport into a giant tuning fork, vibrating with such violence that the air itself seemed to hum with a lethal energy. Then, the rivets began to go. The sound was sharp and rhythmic, like a string of firecrackers going off behind the bulkheads. Pop, 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 pop. Steel bolts the size of a man's thumb, under the impossible shear stress of the oscillating hull, were snapping clean off and turning into jagged shrapnel. They ricocheted off the boilers like champagne corks from hell. Pipes carrying high-pressure steam began to groan, their joints weeping as the ship's very skeleton twisted in a way it was never designed to bend. In the engine room, the junior officers were paralyzed by a bafflement that bordered on terror. They checked their gauges, but the steam pressure was steady, and the fuel flow was perfect. According to their manuals, the ship was performing at its peak. They couldn't understand why the deck plates beneath their feet were blurring, or why the heavy brass housings were cracking before their eyes. They were looking for a fire or a leak, searching for a visible enemy, while the invisible one, the physics of resonance, was liquefying the grease in the bearings and turning the Empress into a metal casket. Jack stood knee-deep in the bilge water of the shaft alley, his hand pressed against the vibrating casing. It felt like touching a live wire. The heat was blistering, the friction of the wobbling shaft generating a thermal signature that warned of an imminent seize. He watched a seam in the hull begin to weep, a tiny spray of Atlantic salt water misting into the room as the plates groaned against the strain. To the men above, this was a mystery of the sea. To Jack's, it was the inevitable conclusion of a rejected blueprint. The ship was no longer a vessel. It was a dying animal, shaking itself apart in a frantic, blind attempt to obey an admiral who didn't understand that even steel has a breaking point. Jax knew the death hum was reaching its crescendo, and the silence that would follow the snap would be the last thing 5,000 men ever heard. The resonance was no longer just a sound, it was a physical weight, a rhythmic thudding in Jax's lungs that mirrored the final, frantic heartbeats of a dying runner. As the Empress shuddered under the Admiral's relentless pace, Jax found himself haunted by the ghosts of the deep. He thought of the Titanic, not as a tragic romance, but as a masterpiece of hubris, a mountain of unsinkable steel undone by the arrogance of men who believed their blueprints were mightier than the sea. He remembered the stories of the Great War, of ships that vanished without a trace, officially listed as victims of U-boats, while the old-timers in the Brooklyn shipyards whispered about cracked shafts and engines that had literally walked off their mounts. History, Jax realized, was written by the survivors, and the survivors were usually the ones who had followed the rules. But the rules were failing. The manual in Commander Miller's hand was a work of fiction, written for a world where steel didn't have flaws and engineers didn't have egos. Jax looked at the vibrating shaft alley, where the paint was already blistering from the heat of the friction. He saw the faces of the soldiers sleeping 3 decks above. Kids from Iowa and Jersey who didn't know their lives were being gambled on a resonance frequency. The psychological weight of the class war shifted in that moment. For years he had deferred to the degrees and the gold braid, feeling the sting of the grease monkey label like a brand. But as a rivet whizzed past his ear and embedded itself in a wooden crate, the hierarchy of the Navy dissolved. Dr. Finch's pristine vellum and Admiral Thorne's strategic maps were worthless in the face of a shearing drive shaft. Pride was the true mechanical failure that sank ships. Jax gripped his pipe wrench until his knuckles turned white against the oil. He understood the choice with a terrifying clarity. He could remain a good sailor, stand at attention, and go down with the ship as a loyal casualty of naval protocol. Or he could become a criminal. He could break the seals, violate the engine room's sanctity, and commit the ultimate act of industrial mutiny. The shadow of the court-martial loomed large, a lifetime in Leavenworth, a dishonorable discharge, the end of his name. But as the Empress groaned in another paroxysm of structural agony, Jax's decision crystallized. It was better to be court-martialed for saving a ship than honored for sinking with it. He turned away from the comms, his eyes searching the shadows for the scrap metal he needed to build his forbidden stabilizer. The death hum was about to meet its match. The air in the machine shop was thick with the smell of ozone and desperation. Jax didn't ask for permission. He took the room by force of will. Behind him stood Silas and two other Black Gang stokers, men with soot-stained lungs and calloused hearts who lived in the heat and the noise, men who knew that the ship's rhythmic thrashing wasn't the ocean, but a death rattle. They didn't need to see the Admiral's charts to know they were dying. They could feel the deck plates curling under their boots. "Lock the hatch," Jax barked, his voice rasping from the diesel fumes. "If any officer comes down here, they don't get in. We're building the stabilizer." Silas, a man built like a mountain of iron, didn't hesitate. He slammed the heavy steel dogs into place, sealing them inside the flickering, yellow-lit sanctuary of the machine shop. Outside, the world was a chaotic nightmare of zigzags and emergency maneuvers as the Empress lunged through the dark Atlantic to evade the U-boat Wolfpack. Every time the helm went hard over, the ship groaned in structural agony, the drive shaft screaming in its distorted housing. They had 20 minutes. 20 minutes to turn a pile of rejected scrap metal and rusted I-beams into a precision-engineered harmonic dampener. Jax moved with a frantic, surgical grace. He didn't have his original drawings, those were in a trash can in Washington, but the blueprint was etched into the back of his eyelids. He fired up the acetylene torch, the blue flame cutting through the gloom like a jagged tooth. "Start the lathe!" Jax yelled over the roar of a nearby steam pipe. "I need those mounting brackets notched to 3/8. Use the reinforced hull plate scrap. We don't have time for a pretty finish. We just need it to hold." The ship lurched violently as a depth charge detonated somewhere in the distance, sending a shockwave through the hull that knocked Silas off his feet. The lights flickered and died for a heartbeat before humming back to a dim, sickly orange. Jax didn't stop. He was welding with his eyes half closed, feeling the rhythm of the vibration to guide his hand. The heat in the room spiked as the torches roared, the temperature climbing toward 120 degrees. Sweat blinded him, but he worked by the sound of the metal. He was a man possessed, a criminal in the eyes of the Navy, fashioning a masterpiece out of junk while the ship's very skeleton threatened to snap. They were racing against two clocks, the torpedoes in the water and the physics of the death hum. If they failed, the mutiny wouldn't matter. If they succeeded, they'd be the only men in the brig of a ship that was still afloat. The moment of truth arrived in a deluge of freezing salt water and white-hot sparks. The Empress took a near miss from a torpedo that buckled a hull plate, and the shaft alley began to flood, the icy Atlantic swirling around Jax's knees. In the center of the room, the drive shaft was a blur of lethal kinetic energy, glowing a dull, angry cherry red from the friction. It wobbled in its housing like a dying top, the death hum now a deafening physical wall of sound that threatened to burst Jax's eardrums. He stood on a slick, vibrating catwalk, the rejected stabilizer, a crude, heavy yoke of welded scrap, suspended by a chain hoist above the spinning metal. This was the impossible geometry of survival. Jax had to weld the mounting brackets to the stationary bearing housing while the shaft beneath it thrashed with enough force to liquefy bone. If his hand slipped by a single millimeter, or if the torch caught the spray of atomized grease, the stabilizer would catch the rotation and become a centrifuge of shrapnel, instantly disemboweling the ship. "Hold the light!" Jax roared, but his voice was swallowed by the mechanical shriek. Silas gripped the chain, his muscles bulging as he fought to keep the heavy iron bracket steady against the ship's frantic zigzagging. Jax lowered his mask. The world narrowed to a tiny pool of blue light and the searing arc of the acetylene torch. He leaned into the heat, the smell of singed hair and wet wool filling his lungs. The water rose to his thighs, cold as a grave, while the air burned his skin. He began the weld, the molten metal flowing like liquid gold into the seam. He wasn't just joining steel to steel, he was grafting his hand-drawn logic onto a broken world. The ship lurched, a violent heave that threw Jax toward the spinning shaft, but he didn't pull back. He pinned his shoulder against a vibrating bulkhead to steady his arm and finished the bead. He slammed the second bracket into place, the heat from the shaft blistering the paint on his tool belt. With a final, desperate burst of the torch, he fused the stabilizer to the housing. Then, it happened. The harmonic resonance, the screaming shriek that had defined the last 4 hours of his life, simply vanished. The violent oscillation smoothed into a deep, rhythmic, and healthy thrum. The deck plates stopped blurring. The rivets stopped popping. The death hum died, replaced by the steady, powerful heartbeat of a machine finally at peace with itself. Jack stood in the rising water, chest heaving, his mask pushed up to reveal eyes red from the glare. The Empress surged forward, outrunning the wolf pack, with a silent, ironclad grace she hadn't known since she left the shipyard. The mechanic had silenced the ego of the Admiral with nothing but a torch and the truth. When the USS Empress finally cut its engines off the coast of France, the silence was the most profound sound Jack's had ever heard. The fleet sat in the grey dawn of the English Channel, a gathering of giants that looked imposing from a distance, but up close they were limping. On every other transport, the emergency flank speed had exacted its toll. Drive shafts were shattered, hull plates were buckled, and engineers were weeping over machines that had literally shaken themselves to death. Only the Empress stood whole, her engines cooling with a rhythmic, healthy metallic tick, the sound of a survivor. The reward for Jax's foresight was the cold bite of steel on his wrists. He was led off the ship in handcuffs before the first soldier hit the beach. Commander Miller wouldn't look him in the eye, and Admiral Thorne stayed on the bridge, his ego insulated by the fact that his flagship had, miraculously, followed his impossible orders. Jax was charged with mutiny, destruction of naval property, and insubordination. He spent the remainder of the war in a brig, stripped of his rank and his name, just another troublemaker the bureaucracy wanted to forget. Years later, long after the war had been won by the men in polished shoes, a package arrived at a small, oil-stained garage in Brooklyn. There was no ceremony, no parade, and no mention in the newspapers. Inside was a Navy cross and a letter with a classified stamp that had been hastily rescinded. The document admitted what the brass never could, that the unscientific stabilizer found on the Empress had been secretly replicated and installed on every ship in the post-war fleet. It was a quiet admission that the man with the wrench had been right all along. Jax didn't hang the medal on his wall. He tucked it into the bottom of a toolbox, beneath a set of worn sockets and a ball-peen hammer. He spent the rest of his life in the quiet hum of his neighborhood, fixing the broken things that others threw away. He never told his neighbors about the night the Atlantic tried to swallow 5,000 men, or how he had welded the world back together in a flooding engine room. He died as he had lived, a man who understood that true power doesn't come from the stripes on a sleeve, but from the ability to hear the soul of a machine and the courage to save it from the men who only know how to drive it. Jax saved the fleet, but his name was erased from the record. Help us restore his legacy by sharing this story with a history buff, and drop a comment below with the word "steal" if you think expertise matters more than ego. What other hidden hero should we cover next?